G'day and welcome to another video with Better Pics. Hope this finds everyone well. Today I wanted to show you a little bit of technique or the process that I go through in editing an image from start to finish. And for this particular image, this was a landscape that was photographed in New Zealand. And for this particular image, I just wanted to first talk about the image and then we'll get underway with the editing process that I'm going to undertake. Now, as with any editing process, there's always many different ways that you can do things. So while this is the techniques that I'll be using today, keep in mind that you may find your own workflows and techniques that work a little bit better solely for the purposes of getting the results that you want to get. So keep that in mind. So firstly, let's just have a look at the image. So this was a waterfall that I discovered, and at that time I was traveling. I had a Fuji X-T2 with me, great little camera, nice and robust and small, and unfortunately I didn't have any neutral density filters, so I found it a little bit hard to get a longer exposure, so to get that sort of soft blur, misty feeling of the water. So as you can see up on the top right hand side here, I was my settings ISO 200, which is the lowest ISO that I could go while still capturing a raw file, a third of a second, and in order to get that exposure length, just to get at least a little bit of movement or blur with the water, unfortunately I had to go up to f20. Normally, because of diffraction, closing your aperture down that much will affect sharpness, but this one seems to be okay. It seems to have come out pretty well. Certainly could have been sharper, but certainly I'm happy with the result. So as you can see with this image, I've photographed it fairly flat. I use a fairly flat profile, which I also use when I'm filming, just to give a little bit more flexibility in post. And that just means that I'm able to retain detail in the highlights and shadows a little bit more effectively. Coupled with shooting in RAW, it really does give me a lot of flexibility. So it does help to get the best results that I can get, and certainly the look that I'm going for. So as I mentioned, we're in Adobe Camera Raw today, which is where I prefer to. As I mentioned, we're in Adobe Camera Raw today, so we'll be doing the full edit into black and white within Adobe Camera Raw. So what I'm going to do just to start with is to come up here on the default landing page or startup page and click on black and white, and that's immediately going to convert the image to black and white. Looking at this image, there's a number of issues that I want to address. As I mentioned earlier, it's a fairly flat profile. My eyes don't seem to really focus anywhere on the screen. Obviously the waterfall is a major feature, but I find that with the rest of the image, it just seems to feel like a clutter of detail that doesn't actually give me anything solid to sort of look through the image. So what I'm going to start with is just the usual adjustments that I would make with really for any image, and then refine it based on what I would like to achieve with this particular image. So I'm just going to start by putting in a little bit more contrast there, just again to give it a little bit more punch, again because I've shot it fairly flat. I'm also going to back off the highlights a little bit, just because I want to try to retain as much of the detail. You can see straight away the detail in the water there coming back a little bit. I'm just going to pull that back a little bit more. Shadows I'm just going to leave where they are at the moment. Clarity, I'm just going to increase the clarity ever so slightly. Just put +5 in there for now, +5, +6. I don't want to go too hard with the clarity, because it sometimes the effect isn't really something that I enjoy, particularly for busy images like this where there's a lot of detail in the image. Moving up to the tone curves, I'm not going to adjust anything there for the moment. I'm just going to put a little bit of sharpening in there, and holding down my Alt key, I'm just going to reduce the areas or the detail where that sharpening is applied. I'm not going to worry about noise reduction because it was shot at a low ISO. Lens correction, I have that switched on for remove chromatic aberration within the camera, so that's checked by default. And that's basically where I'm at the moment. So looking at where I started and where it's now, I think it's a good starting point for a black and white image. There's nice detail everywhere in the image. There's nice contrast and texture. We've managed to save most of the highlights in the water, so I'm really happy with that. And there's nice detail, a little bit of blown out sky up the top there, but it's not a major part of the image, so I'm not too concerned about that at all. I might try and recover some of those highlights a little bit later, but I think they're probably mostly gone. But yeah, it's a good starting point, having, looking at the original color image and where we're at now with black and white. And you can see there's only been a few changes that I've made, and we've got a good starting point. So what I'm going to do now is just drop the exposure just a little bit. Dropping the exposure coupled with the highlights, you can see it gives me a nice rendition of tones, particularly throughout the rocks and the foliage. And again, we've recovered a little bit more. We've got some nice detail happening in that water, in the waterfall as well. And the nice thing now is that we start to really see that the focus is falling more on that waterfall. If I just drop that a little bit further, that brightness level, then you can see that we've still got really nice detail in all of the shadows. There's probably a little bit of boosting of shadows required, and I might do that locally. I've just applied it to the bulk of the image, but I might do a little bit more of that locally with some paintbrush techniques. But what it's doing is reducing the overall brightness and luminosity of the image and the trees and the rocks, obviously, which then allows me to selectively paint in an increase in exposure so that I can highlight specific parts of the image. So now that there's a good base for the image and it's kind of getting closer to where I want it to be, what I'll start to do is start to highlight some of the other areas of the image that I'm keen to just have stand out that little bit more with the final result. So first I'm just going to reduce the exposure a tiny bit more, again without wanting to crush the shadow areas or lose detail in the blacks at all. But now what I'm going to do is move over to the adjustment brush, and basically with the adjustment brush I'm going to start to paint in the exposure so that the image becomes a little bit brighter, and I'm just going to set that to plus 25. Now, the only reason I've gone to plus 25 is because it's a level that I am usually happy with, and it gives me an amount of exposure adjustment that is enough to be seen, but not too much that it's too much with every brush stroke. I can paint it in further if I want to. So I'm just going to start by reducing the size of the brush a little bit, and I'm going to start with this tree just over here on the right hand side of the frame. I'm just going to paint in just a little bit on the outside of those leaves. Just going to uncheck the overlay box, which means those starting points for that adjustment brush are removed, and I just want to start painting in little sections of trees just to highlight them just a little bit. Now there's certainly different ways to do this, and this isn't the be all and end all way, but this is the way that I'm going to go for today. This tree that's just to the left of the waterfall, it's quite interesting compared to the rest of the scene where the foliage is quite strong. This tree looks to be, I don't know if it's dead or but there's just no foliage on there. It may just be, I'm going to photograph this closer to winter, so it may just be a tree that loses its foliage at that time of the year. The beauty of this process is you can make it whatever you want it to be. You can reduce the shadows, the highlights, increase the shadows or highlights in any way that you want to. That's the beauty of creation. it really is ultimately up to you on how you want to present every particular image. Now I'm just going to go back to our default landing page because I just want to increase the clarity a little bit. I'm just going to go up to maybe 15. Let's have a look at that. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit just so that the image, we're looking at the image at 100%. Yep, that looks good. The thing that I like to do with my black and white, in fact color images as well, when it comes to selectively highlighting and darkening different areas, is I try to keep it in a way that looks natural. Even though obviously going back to the original image, the light may look a little bit different, but I don't want it to look like it's been worked on. I want it to look as natural as possible, so that when you go to that sort of scene in person, it tends to look as close as possible to how the images are, or at least the result that I've got with my photographs looks like it's a real scene. Something that I am definitely not interested in is creating unreal landscapes. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with creating any piece of artwork that you want to create, doing anything with your images. That's just the process that I go through. I'm just going to drop that exposure just a little bit more again, and I'm going to come in and paint in the waterfall so that the waterfall's a little bit brighter, without going too far to lose detail in the water. Now, today's video is fairly quick on the scale of things, and you could certainly take a long time. In fact, you could take a whole day editing a particular image if you wanted to. But for the sake of you not falling asleep, that's what I'm going to go for. It's going to be a little bit quicker. Yeah, I'm just going to use a radial filter. Radial filters are a quick way to do very similar to what I did with the paintbrush. Where we are just decreasing a certain part of the image, and in this case we're just decreasing the outer part of the image. You can do exactly the same with the graduated filter as well, shortcut G, where you are applying the filter. As you can see, the green represents where the filter finishes at 100%, and the red is where it finishes. Sorry, the green is where it is at 100%, and then it slightly filters down to red where there is no effect. And as you can see, that's given us a nice little bit of focus again towards this tree and the waterfall. Still with those little highlights on the branches that I painted in earlier. In fact, I'm just going to add a little bit more highlight to that waterfall because I just want it to stand out just that little bit more. Almost as if there's a little bit of a shaft of light coming through there. It's interesting that when I first started out in photography, I never really thought about photographing nature in black and white, but it's something that, when handled properly, you can get some incredibly striking results and some beautiful, peaceful images. Even though obviously the color of nature is quite beautiful and peaceful as well, this allows you to get some incredible results. Ultimately though, that's the beauty of any creative process, where we can create whatever art we want to. So some of the techniques that I've shown you today are techniques that I use commonly on images, but as I mentioned earlier, there's always different ways to do things. So the best thing I can always recommend is to experiment with different techniques, look at different ways of creating different effects with your images, and go for the ones that give you the results that you're after. Thanks very much for stopping in today. Hope you've enjoyed the video and hope it's been helpful. As always, please leave any questions you have below and look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.